Welcome to my channel. Sit back and listen to the best true crime stories. Let's go. If you, like me, are a fan of quality mystical horror movies, then you have quite possibly watched the movies The Spell and The Spell 2, the Amityville Horror, Annabelle's Curse, as well as their numerous sequels and spin-offs. These feature films tell the story of the struggle of intrepid paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren with infernal evil. I don't know if you know the fact that the Warrens are not fictional entities, but quite real people whose activities in their time were incredibly scandalous. Demonology and ghost hunting Warren began to engage in the early 50s of last century. At first founding in 1952, the Society for Psychical Research of New England, in the subsequent Ed and Lorraine, according to them, participated in the investigation of several thousand paranormal phenomena around the world, allegedly caught and exorcised hundreds of spirits, ghosts, demons, and witches, saved the lives of people possessed by the devil, and with heroism worthy of epics, engaged in unequal battles with otherworldly forces. Lorraine assured that since the age of 7 clearly saw the aura of people and animals, could predict the future, communicate with spirits and angels, holding in her hand objects of missing people, clearly knew where to search, could feel the presence of evil forces, and was a powerful medium, able to connect the material world with the spiritual. Ed Warren admitted that he first witnessed poltergeist at the age of 5. Since then, he constantly saw dead people, could communicate with them, and later learned to subdue the demons that came to Earth. Now it is safe to say that it was the Warrens became the main propagandists of fashion for all things paranormal in the 20th century, gained unprecedented popularity among journalists and writers, actively popularized the theme of exorcism, colorfully and intriguingly told stories about their adventures and battle with evil. They created a museum where they displayed artifacts allegedly testifying to their encounters with the supernatural, wrote numerous books, and organized training courses for ghost catchers. Eventually, their tales of war with mystical evil became the basis for many pseudo-documentary and feature films. Of course, the fact that the Warrens really fought with ghosts, believe only fans of all sorts of esotericism, occultism, and mysticism. For most sane people, Warren charlatans, which earnings on human fears put almost on industrial rails. In his time, Ed Warren explained his activities simply, "All the people who come to us are insane. We use this, and the rest we make up, making the story as scary as possible." In general, as they say, nothing is new under the moon. At all times, fraudsters turned human weakness, stupidity, and ignorance into a way of easy enrichment. The most famous investigations of Ed and Lorraine Warren are the cases that have gone down in history under the names the Amityville Horror, the Perron family ghost, the Enfield poltergeist, the story of the Smurl family, the werewolf of Southend, Annabelle's Curse, ghosts in Connecticut, as well as exorcism of a killer demon. None of these cases have been corroborated by photographic and video evidence, reliable eyewitness accounts, or any other facts. Or rather, according to the Warrens, they gathered plenty of evidence. For the most part, they were photographs of mentally unhealthy people, or blurred pictures with obvious defects, lighted spots, and blurred outlines of unidentifiable things. The Warrens argued that all this was sufficient evidence for belief in the existence of spirits and ghosts. Now no one doubts the fact that their pictorial accounts of the terrible struggle with demons Warrens either completely invented themselves or made up using the testimony of eyewitnesses who allegedly observed the paranormal. Most of the stories that made the couple famous were hoaxes, invented from start to finish. But that's not the case with the exorcism of the killer demon case. Part of the story was true. It involved a real crime, the blame for which the murderer tried to place on a demon. With the help of his spouses, Warren proved in court that a demon had possessed him and ordered him to kill a man. This trial was covered by the press in many countries around the world, and it became the first precedent in modern history when judges, jurors, lawyers, and prosecutors had to consider the case with the participation of otherworldly forces. I wanted to tell about the story of the exorcism of the demon killer in order to demonstrate that obscurantism and belief in mysticism often deprive people of reason. They supplant common sense, pervert morality, and give motivation for criminal acts. And they also act as a means of siphoning money out of gullible people. But before I go on to describe it, I will make an excursion into other famous investigations of Ed and Lorraine Warren. It is worth studying them in order, firstly, to understand what the psychic charlatans worked with, and, secondly, to see how, by whom, and for what purpose invented stories about fighting ghosts and spirits. The Amityville Horror. It is worth starting with this case, because even those people who are not interested in the subject of the supernatural have heard about it at least briefly. With him started, and the triumphant fame of the Warrens. And how many books and movies have described this story? Cannot count. It all began with the fact that on December 18, 1975, the family lacked unprecedented luck with the purchase of real estate. In the small village of Amityville on the street Ocean Avenue 112 put up for sale a gorgeous old 3-story mansion with 5 bedrooms, swimming pool, and boathouse. The house was sold for only $80,000, and such a low price was due to a very serious reason. On November 13, 1974, a mass murder took place in this house. 23-year-old Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. shot his entire family. His 42-year-old mother Louise DeFeo, 44-year-old father Ronald DeFeo Sr., 2 sisters, Allison, 13, and Dawn, 18, and 2 brothers 9-year-old John and 12-year-old Mark. Subsequent investigation revealed all of the victims were probably shot in their beds, and it happened around 3 a.m. The victims were shot in their beds. The weapon used in the crime was a Marlin 336C, 35 caliber hunting rifle. Ronald and Louise each had 2 gunshot wounds to the back, and 1 bullet was fired at each of the younger members of the DeFeo family. The boys were shot in the back and the girls in the head. Amityville residents learned of what happened at the mansion from Ronald Jr. at 7:30 in the evening of the same day. He walked into a local bar, from the threshold saying to those present, "You've got to help me. My mother and father have been shot." A whole delegation of regulars from the drinking establishment went to the house and found the bodies of Ronald DeFeo Sr. and his wife Louise. The bodies of the rest of the family were discovered by the police. They wanted to immediately question the only surviving member of the family, Ronald DeFeo Jr., in order to clarify what had really happened. He sobbed and raised his hands to the sky. "My mom and dad are dead," shuddering at the thought of crossing the threshold of his father's house. But then he calmed down a little and went into the kitchen. He told the police that he knew nothing about the circumstances of the murder. Allegedly, he went to work early in the morning, then called home, but no one answered the phone. When he returned in the evening, he realized that his entire family had been murdered. His story was not supported by the evidence, as even a cursory examination of the bodies proved that the victims had died at night while asleep in their beds. There was no way Ronald Jr. could have gone to work in the morning without seeing bodies in the house. Then the witness abruptly changed his testimony and stated that his relatives were killed by a local bandit, Louis Fellini. He had been living in the DeFeo family home for some time and knew that the elder Ronald had a collection of money and jewelry for a rainy day. Along with 4 accomplices, Fellini broke into the house at night and demanded that they give him everything of value. The intruders tied up all members of the DeFeo family and forced Ronald Jr. to watch as they took turns killing them. Both of Ronald's narratives were so confusing, implausible, and inconsistent with the facts that the police immediately suspected him of lying. In addition, almost at the first interrogation, he became interested in the topic of obtaining insurance after the death of all his relatives. Louis Fellini was quickly found. He had an ironclad alibi. He was miles away from Amityville in another state. And not a day later, Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr., backed up against the wall by the evidence, began to stone. And once he started talking, he was talking out of his ass. But, as it would later turn out, all of his words were also lies and fabrications. The psychopath claimed that he had voices in his head ordering him to kill all his relatives. He tried to pass himself off as a madman, detailing that once he started killing, he couldn't stop. According to him, the shooting of 6 people took no more than 15 minutes, after which Ronald took a bath, changed his clothes, and cleaned himself up. He packed his bloody clothes, ammunition and rifle in a pillowcase, drove to Brooklyn, and hid it all in various places. Detectives had little faith in Ronald Jr.'s story. While he was inventing versions of events, they discovered the real history of the DeFeo family. Senior Ronald, nicknamed Big Ronnie, bought a house in Amityville in 1965. Before that, the DeFeos lived in Brooklyn, where the business of the head of the family was not going well. Ronnie hoped that by moving to the village, he could do better. That's why the purchased mansion was optimistically named Great Expectations. Soon, at the invitation of his father-in-law, Ronald Sr. began to manage the local Buick dealership and managed to improve his financial situation. In contrast to the quiet office environment, however, the DeFeo home was despotic and rude. Ronald Sr. had a violent temper. Willful and cruel, he spared neither wife nor children. Strongly built, weighing almost 130 kilograms, often beat Louise. One of the main reasons for their quarrels was the close relationship between Louisa and her father, a wealthy businessman, Michael Brigani. He loved his daughter so much that he was ready to fulfill her every whim. He gave her most of the money to buy a house in Amityville and showered her with gifts. If she asked him to buy her a bottle of perfume, he brought her a suitcase full of different scents to choose from. When Louise complained that her washing machine was broken, Michael Brigani would bring her two of the most expensive models. Louise's father, a successful owner of a chain of car sales companies, could not stand his son-in-law. He considered him a moral freak and a loser, and seeing that his daughter suffers from beatings, persuaded her to leave her oppressive husband. Many later recalled that Louise had periods when she wanted to commit suicide by sticking her head in the oven. And on the eve of her murder, she told friends that she was ready to take the children and leave Big Ronnie. From the difficult character of Ronald Sr. suffered in children, Ronald Jr. got the worst of it, who either by nature or inherited his father's temper, grew up sullen, cruel, angry, and lazy. As a child, he was overweight, and then he lost weight and grew into a big man. But he was not very eager to study and work. He beat his mother and constantly got into fights, so that he was repeatedly threatened with expulsion from school. He was a fan of guns, often stole and used drugs. He liked to drink heavily and go out with prostitutes, for which he regularly asked his father for money. The boy was taken to a psychiatrist, but these visits were of little use. His parents asked him to temper his violent temper, and Ronald, realizing that this is a good reason to blackmail his mother and father, begged for expensive gifts. So at the age of 14, he was given a brand new boat, but Ronald Jr. did not become malleable and exemplary and continued his teenage rampages. A little older, he began working for his father at the company, but even here he was draining fuel from cars or stealing spare parts. A few days before the murder, father and son had a big fight. Ronald Jr. was supposed to take a large sum of money to the bank, but claimed he was robbed on the way. A police investigation on the hot trail revealed that the thief was Ronald Jr.'s best friend. The stolen money was simply shared. Court proceedings on this theft hushed up, but the father threatened the thieving heir that he would throw him out of the house, not giving on the road a penny. In response, the son called his father a miser and threatened to kill him for his greed. On the night of November 13th, he carried out his threat, after which he tried to blame it on uninvolved people or his own insanity. A long and scandalous trial began. A psychiatrist on the defense side tried to convince the court and jury that the younger DeFeo was suffering from a split personality, hearing voices in his head, and could not be sued. But a psychiatric evaluation confirmed Ronald Jr.'s sanity. He was clearly suffering from substance abuse and antisocial personality disorder. The killer had to change his defense. Almost every week of the trial, he began inventing new stories and false theories. The main point of contention in the DeFeo family mass murder case was that all 6 victims were found in virtually identical positions, lying on their stomachs in their beds. According to forensic experts, the crime weapon, a Marlin 336E rifle, was not equipped with a silencer when the shots were fired, and no traces of sedatives or sleeping pills were found in the bodies of the victims. So how come the incredibly loud first shots didn't wake up the rest of the family? Someone surely must have woken up and tried to flee the house. Strangely, neighbors who lived near the Great Expectations home also heard nothing but the barking of the murdered family's dog. Police officers and the medical examiner who first examined the crime scene speculated that Ronald Jr. had someone helping him. Using this unclear moment of the investigation, the killer tried to use it for his own purposes. First, he voiced a version that the main instigator of the murder was his sister Dawn. Allegedly, on the evening of the 12th, she had a big fight with her father, and in the process killed him with a rifle shot. Ronald Jr. learned of the fight between his father and sister allegedly from a phone call from his mother. Dawn wanted to go live in Florida with her boyfriend, and Big Ronnie wouldn't let her. When Ronald Jr. rushed home, he found his father and sister fighting. Dawn even grabbed a knife and tried to shove it down her daddy's throat. His brother pulled them apart and told them to calm down. And when he was in the basement, where the TV was on loudly, he heard several gunshots. Rushing upstairs, I realized that Dawn had shot her father, after which her mother Louise had taken the gun away from her, who, having fallen into a state of madness, first shot her eldest daughter, killed all her children and shot herself in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. When Ronald saw his siblings dead, it was as if he had turned into a berserker. He shot his mother with a rifle in a frenzy, and for a long time he could not come to his senses to realize what grief had happened in their home. But the main thing, according to DeFeo, that all this situation had a witness, Richard Romando. He came with Ronald Jr. that night to the Great Expectations house, saw the whole thing happen, and can attest to DeFeo's innocence. It was Romando who collected the shell casings, revolver, rifle, and other evidence to hide later. He said that the murders would be blamed on Ronald, so the crime scene had to be prepared and cleaned up before the police arrived. No one believed this story in court. The picture of the crime was completely inconsistent with the story of Ronald DeFeo Jr. Neither Dawn nor her father had any signs of beatings. Dawn's hands were clean of gunpowder gases. Number 38 caliber shell casings or revolver were found. Louise was shot in the back, not the head, and with a .35 caliber rifle. But most interestingly, no Richard Romando seems to have existed in the world. No one had ever known or seen such a man. So at the conclusion of the trial, on November 21, 1975, Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was given 6 life sentences. Sitting on the benches, the psychopath almost daily made appeals, changing his story, apparently, depending on the degree of inflammation of the diseased brain. He invented a new version. Dawn and a criminal unknown to him killed his parents, sister, and brothers. Having seen this, Ronald killed the Mad Dawn, but only accidentally, in the course of a fight, when he tried to take away her rifle. All this can again confirm Richard Romando, who saw the incident with his own eyes. In 2000, Ronald DeFeo came up with the following tale which he narrated to writer Rick Osen. This time, the killer's tale again featured his sister Dawn, as well as 2 of her friends, Augie DeGennaro and Bobby Kelsky. Allegedly, Ronald and Dawn both hated their oppressive parents, whom they agreed to kill together. But afterward, Dawn decided that her younger sister and brothers should also be eliminated as possible witnesses. Ronald was enraged by the murder of the children, attacked Dawn. She fell unconscious on the bed, and he shot her in the head. This DeFeo Jr. story, like all the others before it, didn't fit the evidence at all. Dawn was found in her nightgown, without a single mark of violence on her body, save for a bullet hole in her head. Nothing to indicate she'd been involved in a murder or a fight with anyone. DeFeo Jr. is still alive today. He sits in Sullivan Prison in Fallsburg, New York, awaiting his 69th birthday. And many non-believers still speculate that he did not commit his murders alone. Based on the fact that all the victims at the time of death were lying on their stomachs, they conclude that DeFeo had an assistant, either some unknown accomplice or indeed Dawn. In my opinion, these assumptions are completely unfounded. To kill 6 people the way DeFeo Jr. did doesn't require helpers at all. Ronald Sr. and Louise were the first to be killed, as the forensic evidence suggests. Everyone else likely heard gunshots but didn't realize in their sleep what was going on. They were forced to lie on their stomachs at gunpoint by the killer himself. Then he fired the fatal shot at each of them individually. It wouldn't have taken him long to do all that. It's not that hard to deal with kids who don't fully believe their own kind can shoot them. With Dawn, Ronald may have hit a snag. There's a possibility that the evil sibling didn't kill her on the bed. There was a huge gaping wound in Dawn's head, and blood and brain matter were found on her pillow, nightgown, and bedclothes. But the white headboard of her bed appeared clean. Dawn's blood spatters were found on the floorboards and on the dresser, which may indicate, at the time of her death, the girl was standing and maybe trying to talk to her brother. But he turned her back to him and shot her from behind. And after that he laid Dawn's body, giving it a certain pose. I don't rule out the possibility of using some non-standard silencer, which DeFeo never told the police about. Why else would the neighbors not have heard the sounds of 8 gunshots each at least 140 decibels loud? Criminalists rejected the theory of silencer use only on the basis of traces of gunpowder gases found on the victims' bodies. But, first, in the 1970s, forensic science was not yet so advanced. And secondly, the primitive silencer used may not have completely blocked the gunpowder gases, but it could have significantly dampened the force of the sound. That Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. is a mass murderer and family annihilator should not be questioned. His motive for his murder is a psychopathic personality disorder and a desire to hijack his parents' property and insurance policies. If he had any accomplices, the chatty DeFeo, unable to keep his mouth shut, would have given them away 100 times over. And forensics show that all 6 victims were killed with the same weapon. References to possible witnesses and accomplices were verified by the police. The killer's words were either false or made up. And if Dawn had wanted to kill her parents with Ronald, she probably wouldn't have worn a nightgown to do it, but something more comfortable and not stained. That's a brief description of the story of the Great Expectations house in Amityville. A true horror story that doesn't involve spirits or otherworldly forces. When, 13 months after the mass murder of the DeFeo family, George and Kathy Latz decided to buy the house on the cheap, it was a story they knew. But they weren't scared, which they openly told their real estate broker. Suddenly, on the first day of move-in, it was as if they were confronted with strange phenomena. In the windows of the mansion desperately beat birds, the electricity was malfunctioning, and in the head of the father of the family, George Latz, suddenly sounded scary voices whispering threats. Over the next 28 days, Kathy, George, and their 3 children were attacked by evil spells. Spirits, whether of murdered members of the DeFeo family or demons from the underworld, moved chairs, smashed furniture, wrote curses on the walls, and intimidated the Latz sons. Unknown forces lifted Katie into the air, then threw her on the bed and raped her. Even the head of the family, George Latz, was sexually abused. From the walls of the scary house oozed green slime. Objects and black swarms of flies flew around the rooms, sounds of an orchestra, and the youngest daughter Missy communicated with the ghost of Jody, who appeared to her in the form of a girl, then turned into a pig with red eyes. Every night, at 3:15, about the time Ronald DeFeo Jr. committed his murders, George Latz would wake up with horrible nightmares. Mysterious hoofprints were appearing in the snow outside the house. A crucifix hanging by the headboard of the bed was spinning like a wolf. To top it off, the Latz discovered a strange red room in the basement, obviously set up for satanic rites. The priest who was summoned could do nothing about the demons in the house. So, unable to resist the onslaught of evil spirits, on January 14, 1976, the Latz family fled the house in Amityville. They left all their belongings behind in the spooky dwelling. They stopped paying their mortgage, and afterward began to wonder if the younger Ronald DeFeo had committed the murders, driven by otherworldly forces. After thinking about it for a while, they decided they should share their story with the world. They recorded 45 hours of memories of encounters with the supernatural and gave them to writer Jay Anson. He quickly penned his great bestseller, The Amityville Horror, with the words that it was based on true events. There was little about the DeFeo family murders, but there were many descriptions of the Latz's suffering. In 1979, the book became the basis for the movie of the same name, and the fame of the horrors of Amityville spread throughout America. Nonfiction story about the harsh trials of the Latz family in a terrible house captivated the minds of ordinary Americans. But the participants of the events brought fame, but little dividends. The Latz story left much to be desired. Everyone who tried to talk to them noted that in their stories reigned complete chaos. The memories of each of the family members contradicted each other. The notorious Red Room turned out to be nothing more than a basement, giving repairmen access to the house's plumbing. The windows and doors, which the Latzes said seemed to have been torn off their hinges by ghosts, turned out to be in place, their fasteners still original, and the paint and putty not peeling. The demonic pig that was Missy was most likely the neighbor's black cat. And the stories of hoof prints in the snow could not be true, for those days in Amityville were snowless. After fleeing the house, George and Kathy Latz contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, not yet famous throughout America, but already well-known ghost catchers. On February 24, 1976, they arrived at the Great Expectations house with a local television crew. They would later tell us that upon entering the house, they were immediately attacked by demons. This evil had been building up in Great Expectations, supposedly fueled by the hatred of Ronald DeFeo Jr. Having gained power beyond measure, it was ineradicable and inexhaustible. The Warrens fought it like tigers, but it won, nearly killing the pure of heart fighters against evil spirits. So after taking many photographs and audio recordings, the Warrens left their home in Amityville. And after many years colorfully and relishfully told that this case for them was the most terrible, the evil of the murder house, cunning and wise, had long haunted the ghost catchers. So much so that Lorraine was even afraid to talk about it when she was riding in a moving vehicle. The appearance of the Great Expectations house story on television catapulted the Warrens to the pinnacle of fame, cementing their title as top paranormal experts. All of this happened despite the lack of any evidence of spirits in the Amityville house. The tagline, "This is a true ghost story," firmly connected with the case. And with the release of the horror movie, the Warrens' fame reached a peak. But in 1979, the story of the Latz family suffered a near-fatal wound. Joel Martin, host of a radio program devoted to all things supernatural, interviewed William Weber, attorney for Ronald DeFeo Jr., and the latter admitted that together with George Latz, they concocted a story about a haunted house. They had been thinking about the idea in the evenings, drinking more than one bottle of something strong. Weber needed to start a new trial for DeFeo, and the haunted house story might help the jury believe Ronald was innocent. Say, the guy was under the influence of an otherworldly force, and therefore not responsible for the crimes. Latz's story about the paranormal could bring fame and money. George Latz's architectural business was breathing on the lam, and the mortgage had to be paid by something without delay. In response to this statement, the Latzes continued to claim that most of their narrative was true, except for the green slime oozing out of the walls of the house and the broken windows and doors. They didn't get any money for the Amityville Horror. It turned out they told their story to another writer, thus breaking their agreement with Jay Anson. Then Latz along and Tedious sued with publishers and movie companies, newspapers, and William Weber. All lost, and they never earned anything from their tales. In 1977, Jim and Barbara Cromartie bought the Great Expectations house from the bank, and the new owners never experienced anything paranormal. The only thing they suffered from was an invasion of crazy tourists and lovers of everything mysterious, because of which they were soon forced to change their place of residence. Today, the legendary house in Amityville continues to stand on the old site, but it was given a new official address to confuse the ghost seekers. The exterior and interior design of the house has been significantly changed, so that it is now almost unrecognizable. The residents of Amityville hate anything to do with the creepy history of the Great Expectations house. You won't find a single mention of the DeFeo family or the Latz on the village's website. The werewolf of South End famous ghost fighters the Warren couple, along with a Catholic priest and police officers, exorcise an evil werewolf spirit from a human body. Sounds like a description of one of the episodes of the TV series Supernatural. But according to the book Werewolf, the true story, written by Ed and Lorraine Warren, it's pure truth and no fiction. The case of the werewolf in South End is one of the most ridiculous cases the Warrens have dealt with. It paints the story of a simple London carpenter, Billy Ramsey, who thought he was a werewolf even from childhood. Reading it, one begins to feel twofold feelings. On the one hand, you want to laugh at it, on the other, to cry. The point is that, although Billy Ramsey was incredibly popular at one point in the story, no one paid proper attention to his real problem. And he clearly needed that attention. What Ramsey was doing was either severe mental illness or an irresistible urge to be noticed. But to his misfortune, he had only police officers, clergymen, and the Warrens, who were clearly unreliable helpers. But let's get on with it. William Ramsay was born in the seaside resort town of Southend-on-Sea in the county of Essex. He first felt abnormal in 1952 when he was 9 years old. One summer afternoon, while playing alone in the backyard, Ramsay felt a cloud of icy, stinking perfume envelop him. He felt frightened and tormented. Nausea rose to his throat, and in his head there was a desire to immediately run away from home somewhere in the forest, in the expanse of nature. In the body suddenly flared up such a gushing power and energy that it immediately needed to be spent. The boy rushed to the fence and wanted to climb over it, as suddenly he heard his mother's call from behind. It was as if it had brought him back from his oblivion, reminded him that Ramsay was a boy, not a forest animal. Stunned, stopped by an invisible hand, he no longer wanted to run, but to tear, bite, and maim. There was anger and impatience, hatred for all things human, and a longing for the animal. The energy that came in a mind-blowing wave was surging over the edge and demanded an outlet. The child grabbed one of the fence posts and tore it out of the ground. Growling and kicking, he glared at his parents who had jumped out into the street. Then he tore off a piece of fence netting, put it in his mouth, and began to chew on it. Seeing this, Billy's mother and father were scared out of their wits, ran into the house, slammed the doors behind them, and left the growling child alone in the street. They only came out when little Ramsay seemed to calm down completely. After the incident, the boy came to his senses, remembered nothing, and did not understand why he was scolded. Everything was written off as childish unsteadiness, and the incident was completely forgotten. For the next almost 15 years in the life of Bill Ramsay, nothing extraordinary happened. He grew up, married, and became the happy father of 3 children. But, as he later recounted, his life was actually torture. He reacted animal-like to all bright sounds and smells. He felt uneasy around people. Almost every night he had nightmares in which he was a wolf, wanted to howl every time the moon spilled brightly in the sky. All this went on for months and years. Sometimes Ramsay would wake up and realize he wasn't at home in bed, but outside, somewhere in the woods. His wife and children thought he was sleepwalking, and so it continued for the next 16 years. It was 1983. That evening, Billy Ramsay was sitting in a pub with a group of friends. After a few beers, he suddenly realized that the feelings of animal hunger had returned to him. Once again, his body was enveloped in an icy, stinking blob of air. The faces of the men swam and turned into beastly grins. Their throats beckoned with the tantalizing taste of blood. And to keep from snapping, Billy left the hall, heading for the restroom. He washed his face with ice-cold water and looked in the mirror. There was a wolf staring back at him, foam hanging from its fangs. Billy caught his breath and went back into the hall, telling his friends it was time to leave. In the car, the urge to sink into someone's flesh grew stronger and more irresistible. Sitting in the back seat, he growled and grabbed the thigh of a fellow traveler sitting next to him with his teeth. He scratched it with his nails and tried to tear off a piece of meat. The car was stopped. Ramsay was dragged outside, but he was kicking and acting like a rabid animal. It took a lot of time and effort to calm the distraught man. Since then, Billy had been called crazy in front of his eyes. A couple of months went by, and suddenly, a few days before New Year's Eve, Billy had a heart attack. As the emergency room nurse at the local hospital began to take his blood pressure, he bit into her arm with his teeth. And then he broke out of his seat and started running around the wards, terrifying the staff and patients. Witnesses would later say that at that moment Bill looked more like a rabid beast. Hunched shoulders, crouched arms, and bared teeth. Anyone who dared approach him, Ramsay would knock him down and bite him. He'd lunge at people and bang his head against walls. It took a whole team of strong and large nurses before he could be restrained and sedated. The police, who had arrived by this time, put steel bracelets on the violent man's arms and took him to the station. In the cell, Ramsay immediately fell asleep, and in the morning there was nothing left of his abnormal behavior. He again had no memory of what had happened or why he had been arrested. Ramsay was referred to a psychiatrist, who listened to his story and said that Billy needed a full evaluation and treatment. The patient agreed with this decision, but never came back to the psychiatrist. A new seizure occurred in January 1984 while Bill was visiting his mother. She called an ambulance and Ramsey was taken to the same hospital where he had frightened the staff and visitors not long before. It happened again. Once again, Ramsey lashed out at a nurse. The police were called, and they twisted him up. As a result of the struggle, one of the 4 police officers was seriously injured. The frantic man was handcuffed and taken to the local police station, where a psychiatrist was immediately summoned. A mental health counselor told Ramsey he needed immediate medical attention, but he flatly refused treatment, attributing his attacks to nervous breakdowns. On July 22, 1987, Bill Ramsey came to the police station and asked to be locked up in a cell because he was afraid he would hurt someone. But no sooner had the cops figured out how to lock up an innocent man in a cell than Ramsey attacked them. Like a rabid animal, he lunged at SGD Terry Fisher, grabbed him by the throat, ripped him from the floor, and threw him across the room. Another policeman was scratched and tried to bite. In the end, it took a dozen tough cops and 2 shots to finally subdue the deranged man. After that, psychiatric treatment was forced on Billy Ramsey, not voluntary. Numerous MRIs, X-rays, and blood tests could not determine the cause of William Ramsey's insanity. But psychiatric tests clearly said, he is crazy. And then, fortunately, Billy in London arrived and the wife Warren. Great demonologists, having learned about the case of the man-wolf, immediately decided that he was possessed by a demon. After talking to the police on the phone, Lorraine convinced the officers that Ramsey needed an exorcism. And these power-hungry suckers gave poor Billy to the Warrens. He was exorcised in 1989 in a Connecticut church, and the clergyman, Bishop Robert McKenna, participated in the process. This remarkable act, by the way, was sponsored by the People newspaper. The night before the exorcism was to take place, Ramsey attempted to strangle his wife while she slept. At first, when the episcopos began gibbering his Latin invocations for the demon to leave Ramsey's body, the man remained unconcerned and did not react in any way. But suddenly the man took on a completely different appearance, grinning, putting forward his curled hands, and snarling at the priest. Okay, I think I've described enough of this nonsense. According to the Warrens, the exorcism went well, and William Ramsey was completely freed from the demon. But most importantly, they videotaped the whole thing to prove to people like me, people who don't believe in mysticism, that it was real. The last time Bill Ramsey appeared in public was in 1992. He gave an interview, and after that he disappeared into obscurity. No one else was interested in him, and he was successfully forgotten. The Warrens claimed that the case of the South End werewolf was their most documented confrontation with the forces of hell. But in reality, apart from the words in the book and the numerous stories in the press, the Warrens never showed anyone anything. But for the followers of the 4 demonologists, it is not the point. The very presence of the famous couple near the Wolfman, as well as the participation in his exorcism of Bishop McCann, is sufficient evidence for them that it was all true. In reality, Billy Ramsey most likely suffered from what is known as clinical lycanthropy, a delusional condition in which a person believes he or she is turning into a wolf. The condition, though rare, is known to psychiatrists. Clinical lycanthropy is a form of zoanthropy. Other forms are ophidianthropy, synanthropy, gallianthropy, and others. According to experts, zoanthropy is most often a manifestation of schizophrenia, clinical depression, or bipolar disorder. So it's almost certain that Billy Ramsey was seriously ill. He should have been treated. But the Warrens made a scarecrow out of him. Instead of the help this man needed, they fed him tales of devils and exorcisms. By the way, rumor has it that the upcoming sequel to the movie series, Spell 3, will feature just the story of Billy Ramsey's Wolfman. The ghost of the Perron family, another Warren hoax, is the so-called Perron family ghost story. Apparently, the Warrens did not invent it entirely on their own, but took the tales of the Perron family members as a basis, then embellished them, gave them more mysticism and horror. The stupidity of this hoax lies primarily in the fact that it is supposedly based on historical facts. But such facts are always verifiable. Even with a superficial examination of the physical evidence of the case of the Phantom of Perron, it is clear that everything in it is made up. By the way, it is with this story and begins the first movie, The Spell, 2013 release. A very high-quality horror movie, spectacular and emotional. And this is the movie version of the story of the Perron family. They themselves it together with Ed and Lorraine Warrens told it somewhat differently. So the credits based on true events accompanying this movie are a double lie. That's what the Warrens and members of the Perron family say happened at the Harrisville farm. It began as if Roger and Carolyn Perron bought a farm in the country town of Harrisville, Rhode Island, in December 1970. The 200-acre property had enough room to run a good farm and raise their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cynthia, and April. However, when the Perrons moved into the 14-room house built in 1736, they were unaware of its gruesome history. It turned out that in the 19th century, it was the home of one Bathsheba Thayer, who had 4 children. 3 of them died in childhood under strange circumstances, and neighbors suspected that Bathsheba had killed them. Members of the local community believed the woman to be a witch who conducted satanic rituals in the basement of the house. She tried to kill her last, 4th child a week after giving birth with a large sewing needle, but her husband stopped her. The woman was openly accused of witchcraft and Satanism for a long time, and finally, at the age of 93, she hanged herself in the backyard on the bough of a spreading old oak tree. And before she died, she cursed all who would live on her land. After her death, Bathsheba's body became so petrified that it was barely removed from the tree. When the Perrons moved into the house, they encountered her spirit as well as the ghosts of former residents, servants, and murdered children. Unlike the Amityville house, the Perrons' ghosts were not always scary and harmful. The spirits of dead children sometimes played with the Perron daughters and even helped them do chores around the house. The ghosts of servants were always trying to tell them something and warn them of danger. But the spirit of Bathsheba was always plotting some kind of intrigue, scaring and maligning. Moved furniture, turned off the heat, made noise, littered, and most importantly, supposedly jealous of Carolyn Perron, all his anger directed against her. He appeared to her as a tall woman with her head down and wearing an old gray dress. He said that the entire Perron family was cursed and should leave the house and find another home. He left huge bruises on Carolyn, emitted clouds of stinky air, ruined the food she cooked, and even once stabbed her in the leg with a large sewing needle. In a word, he was making her miserable. But to Roger showed more attention, harassed, and even tried to have sex with him. The worst place in the house was the basement. When one of the Perrons went down there, he was always attacked by demons and spirits. Carolyn, trying to find out what was going on in her house, began researching the history of the farm and discovered that it had been owned by the Arnold family for 8 generations. During that time, several members of the family and their servants have died in horrible and mysterious circumstances. Children have drowned in the river, one man was murdered, someone was accidentally burned, and several have committed suicide. After all the Arnolds died, the farm was purchased by Bathsheba Thayer, who practiced Satanism. Until 1974, the Perrons, gritting their teeth, tolerated all the attacks of demons, but after learning about the fame of the Warrens, turned to them for help. Lorraine Warren arrived at Perron Farm and tried to talk to the ghosts to persuade them to leave the innocent family alone. But somehow things didn't work out the way the medium expected. An evil spirit possessed Carolyn Perron and began to torment her body. One day, when Lorraine once again tried to talk to the spirit, suddenly the legs of the chair on which Caroline was sitting came off the floor and the woman hovered in the air, and then suddenly began to speak in a strange, eerie voice in an unknown language. Her husband Roger, supposedly incredibly frightened by this, demanded that Lorraine stop communicating with the otherworldly force. He put the medium outside and told her not to come back. The Perron family lived on the farm, attacked by ghosts, for another 6 years, and only in 1980 managed to sell it and move elsewhere. In 2011, one of the daughters, Andrea, wrote a book about her contact with the spirits, House of Darkness, House of Light. The True Story, in which she detailed what happened to the Perron family on the farm. A still from the movie, The Spell, Lorraine Warren, played by actress Vera and Farmiga, fights for Carolyn's soul occupied by Bathsheba I, on the other hand, will try to tell you the real story of Bathsheba Thayer and her estate. This story will be based on actual historical documents. To begin with, the whole incident about the haunting of Perron Farm is based on the claim that it was once the home of Bathsheba Sherman, a witch who sacrificed children in satanic rituals. She was hated for this and eventually committed suicide. Bathsheba Thayer is a real person, and she did live in Harrisville on a farm that was purchased by the Perron family in 1970. But here is all the other information about her that is not true. According to historical records, Bathsheba Thayer was born in 1812 to Ephraim Thayer and Hannah Taft. Ephraim's first wife's name was Bathsheba, and she died of some infectious disease, apparently typhoid. Married a second time, Ephraim decided to name one of his daughters after her. Andrea Perron writes in one of her books that the witch Bathsheba had the surname Arnold before her marriage, but this is not true. From birth, she was Thayer. The real Bathsheba married quite late for those times, when she was a little over 30. Her chosen one was local Judge Judson Sherman, by whom she had 4 children, and 3 of them actually died in childhood, except not as a result of mysterious misfortunes, but because of disease. In the middle of the 19th century, child mortality was very high. Only one son, Herbert Leander Sherman, survived. Harrisville census records for 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880 show that Herbert was alive and well. No one killed him or sacrificed him to the devil. He was living with his parents on a farm, to which he brought his first wife, Georgine. The latter, however, died at the age of 22 years and was buried in the village cemetery. In 1880, Herbert remarried to Anna Jane Fair. The couple had 2 sons, William and Fred. There is not a single mention of any scandals, accusations against the Sherman family and Bathsheba directly, or of any strange deaths or accidents in any of the historical records of Harrisville Township, and by the way, there are many of these records. The 3 deceased children of Bathsheba and Judson Sherman were not sacrificed to the devil. They were quietly and peacefully buried in the Harrisville Cemetery. Bathsheba died May 25, 1885, of a stroke, and her death certificate makes no mention of petrification of the body. The Rev. A. H. Granger, a Baptist minister, conducted the woman's funeral. Do you think she'd be buried in the city cemetery next to her children if the citizens of Harrisville thought Bathsheba was a witch? She was not only buried here, but she was given a funeral service, and an obituary was published in the local newspaper. When she died, her remains were interred next to her husband, Judson, who had died 4 years earlier. In her will, Bathsheba gave all of her property and money to her son and grandson. Regarding the Arnold family, who, according to the Perrons and Warrens, supposedly originally owned the farm, are also twisted. The Arnolds did live in Harrisville, but owned a very different estate, located a few miles from Bathsheba's house. Over the generations, of course, they had their share of deaths from unnatural causes. For example, one Arnold, John, had his wife of 50 years, Susan, hang herself in the storeroom of her parents' house. It happened on April 18, 1866. By all accounts, the woman was suffering from clinical depression. This death did not occur on the farm that the Perron family later bought, or even at the Arnold estate. Another Arnold, Edwin, went into the woods in 1903 and got lost and froze. His body was not found until 3 months after his disappearance. 2 years earlier, in 1901, one of the Arnold servants, Jarvis Smith, got drunk, climbed into a barn, fell asleep there, and also froze to death. In 1911, 57-year-old John Arnold committed suicide by drinking Paris Green. The unfortunate man, it seems, had cancer. He did it in his home in the town of Duxbury, Massachusetts, that is, again, not on the ill-fated farm, but far from it. Andrea Perron also claimed in her book that the house her family bought was once the home of young Prudence Arnold, whose spirit visited them. This is true, but only partially true. The murder of 12-year-old Prudence C. Arnold took place in 1840, and it happened in the town of Axbridge, Massachusetts, where the girl lived with her foster parents. In its time, it was a high-profile murder that went down in history as the Axbridge Affair. The killer was 22-year-old William Knowlton, a young man who had been harassing Prudence. He claimed he killed her out of jealousy and love. Allegedly, Prudence had refused to marry him as she had promised 4 months earlier. In a state of rage and passion, he raped her and stabbed her to death with a razor. And as you realize, all this happened far from the Harrisville farm, too. Axbridge is 9 miles away. So there is no physical evidence that Bathsheba Sherman was considered a witch by her neighbors. Nor is there any information that there were any accidents, murders, or suicides specifically on the farm purchased by the Perron family. It appears that Carolyn Perron, along with Ed and Lorraine Warren, did indeed research Harrisville's historical records. Taking various histories of the town and the Arnold family over the years, they mixed everything together and invented a case called The Haunting of the Perron Family. The motives for concocting this tale, I think, are the same as in all previous and subsequent Warren investigations: fame and money. And yes, after the Perrons sold the farm, it became home to Norma Sutcliffe and Jerry Nelfrich, who never encountered anything supernatural in the house. But after the movie The Spell was released on the screens, they suffered from the invasion of crazy fans of the paranormal. The cemetery in Harrisville, where supporters of the Perron ghost story come to see Bathsheba Sherman's grave, also suffers from them. Not too long ago, some of them destroyed the tombstone on the grave. Some have been bringing in some recording devices and trying to contact the spirit of the witch. They don't want to realize that Bathsheba was a completely real person, and what they are doing is called vandalism and desecration of the grave. On June 21, 2019, the former Perron farm was purchased by Corey and Jennifer Heinzen for $439,000. These folks are also lovers of the mystical, as they happily report in every interview they give to local newspapers. And of course, they talk about the fact that they have encountered paranormal phenomena in the house. The doors open by themselves, strange noises and voices are heard, black fog flies around the house, sometimes acquiring the contours of a person. It is likely that Corey and Jennifer Heinzen will continue to make up stories about the spirits of the old Bathsheba Sherman farm, not caring at all that their foolish antics will in fact commit a crime against the memory of a real person. And other Warren tales roughly similar to the Perron ghost case were Ed and Lorraine Warren's investigations into the infield poltergeist, the spirits of the Deedle family, ghosts in Connecticut, the story of the Pale Lady in Union Cemetery, and the ghost of the nun in Borley Church. All of these stories were invented and embellished, made up from start to finish, or based on urban legends. Of course, the Warrens did not do it all themselves, but always with the participation of people who either strongly believe in something paranormal or half crazy or fraudulent. For example, in the case of the infield poltergeist, it is safe to say that its main participant, 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, was the originator and performer of the whole hoax. She was assisted by her sister and mother, later by the Warrens themselves. Neurasthenic and intelligent Janet was an artistic girl who long managed to fool gullible people. When she grew up, she confessed that most of the story of the infield poltergeist created with her sister. What they had originally planned as a childish prank ended up spinning out of control. The adults believed it, and it turned the children on to even worse antics. In the Death and Snedeker family, the main perpetrators of hoaxes were also children, and their parents, sensing that there was money to be made, joined in creating the hoax and tried to get some bonuses. Observations of various spirits in cemeteries and churches were invented by the Warrens out of thin air. A rural or urban legend was taken as a basis, then Ed Warren or his assistant went to the place where the spirit supposedly appeared and made a blurry filming of something unclear, foggy, and dim. These videotapes Warren showed to few people. If you want to find them on the internet, you won't be able to. Ed Warren himself never attempted to examine the videos he or his assistants shot with any scientific rigor or criticality, and he has always refused to turn over video footage to outside labs for study. At the same time, both he and Lorraine repeated in all interviews and lectures that they were engaged in scientific research into the beyond. But in reality, it was a lie, like all the Warrens' activities. I don't even want to talk about the Annabelle doll. It's the ultimate fairy tale. Yes, fascinating, disturbing, and penetrating with horrific details into the very depths of our primal fears. But a fairy tale. The Warrens made very good money on all these stories. No, they didn't charge for occult research and exorcising spirits and demons. They wrote books and sold thousands of copies. They took part in screen adaptations of their stories as consultants and occasional actors. Traveling around the world, they organized lectures to which admission cost up to $1,000. Often such gatherings were full houses. Hundreds and even thousands of people tried to get through to hear the Warrens. Some simply out of curiosity and desire to penetrate the esoteric culture. Others wanted to learn from the great ghost catchers, absorbing at their lectures every word as an immutable truth. It is curious to try to understand what was the secret to the success of the Warrens' machinations. How did they manage to convince a huge number of people to believe in falsehoods? In my opinion, the explanation lies in the field of human psychology, which Warrens, like all swindlers, subtly felt. Quite a large stratum of people both then and now, I suspect, and in the future, want to believe in something supernatural. Subconsciously, they like to think that our lives are run by some higher power. It can be blamed for failures, setbacks, misfortunes, and misfortunes. It is too easy and uninteresting to blame ordinary concrete people for the sorrows of a person, a country, or a nation. Their stupidity, greed, fear, poffagism, and bluster. It is easier to invent ghosts and spirits, Freemasons and global government, the conspiracies of billionaires and ubiquitous corporations. Another secret of the Warren couple's success was their likability. Ed and Lorraine were a nice couple, smiling, polite and calm, played the part of simple people, endowed with a hard but necessary gift, ostensibly tired of it, but always ready to help. They could tell picturesquely about spirits and had a peculiar gift of persuasion. They said what the lovers of all things mysterious wanted to hear. They were their voice, spoke for them. So far, Ed and Lorraine Warren had fooled only those who wanted to believe. Oh, it's easy to fool me. I'm glad to be deceived. Their fraud was in the realm of consensual deception. In fact, it did not cross the boundaries of the law and did not interfere with the activities of Themis. But everything changed in the story of Exorcism Demon Killer when a couple of demonologists tried to act as witnesses in court and dismiss the real killer by the will of the devil or the work of a murderous demon. This is the story that the third installment of the movie Spellbound, which was originally planned to be released in September 2020, is meant to tell. It is now unknown whether it will be released on time, but in any case it will be a fabulous interpretation of the case by the will of the devil. I, on the other hand, am going to describe her real-life circumstances, which went down in the history of the U.S. judicial system as the trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson. The trial was a high-profile and highly publicized trial, described in a book and televised more than once. It was the first time in American history that a suspect tried to use demonic possession as a defense in a murder trial. Going a little ahead, I will say that he did not succeed. On November 24, 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter, but he only served 5 years in prison for it. So, it all happened on February 16, 1981. In the small country town of Brookfield, Connecticut, a wasted 19-year-old Arne Cheyenne Johnson attacked a similarly drunk 40-year-old Alan Bono with a 5-inch pocket knife. He stabbed him 6 times in the chest and abdomen area, causing him to die several hours later in the hospital. Police arrested Arne Johnson a couple of hours later, 3 kilometers from the scene of the crime. There were 3 witnesses to the murder: Debbie Glatzel, the girl Arne was dating at the time, her sister Wanda, and Debbie's 9-year-old cousin Mary. In the opinion of the police and any reasonable person, it was a commonplace domestic drunken murder, classified in the U.S. as a so-called open and shut case. Detectives collecting evidence on it considered it simple, solved, and not requiring excessive attention. That was until the suspect's lawyer, 33-year-old Martin Manella, came up with a strategy to declare Arne Cheyenne possessed by the devil. That's when things got interesting. The murderer's story suddenly took on incredible details and demonic context. According to Manella, Arne was not an ordinary killer, but almost a hero who had taken a blow from otherworldly forces. The name of these forces was a legion of 43 demons. The clever lawyer's made-up story went like this. Debbie, the girl Arne was dating, had an 11-year-old brother, David Glatzel. A few months before Alan Bono's murder, this boy had been possessed by a legion of demons. For a long time, evil forces tormented both the child and his entire family. The Glatzels, exhausted and frightened by these sinister proceedings, which began after they had taken possession of the rented house, turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren for help. The two had witnessed repeated manifestations of the supernatural and tried to help the Glatzels. Together with several Catholic priests, they gave David an exorcism session. During it, Arn Cheyenne began to poke evil fun at the demons, thus invoking their wrath upon himself. One of the 43 servants of hell, unable to bear the mockery, threw the child's body and moved into a 19-year-old young man. And it was his whispering that led Arn to stab Alan Bono. Thus, according to the defense attorney, Cheyenne Johnson could not be tried, for he was unhinged and under the power of a demon. To say that the prosecution and the court were dismayed by this line of defense is to say nothing. There is not a single case in U.S. case law where anything like this has ever happened. However, Minnell was not deterred by this, citing 2 cases in British practice. In the first, a man accused of arson was completely acquitted. In the second, a rape was blamed on otherworldly forces and the accused received a suspended sentence. So why, according to Minnell, should the American court not take these 2 precedents into account? Prosecutors and judges thought about it, but not for long. It was obvious to everyone that the clever lawyer was trying to use such a strategy for the sole purpose of self-promotion. In the late 20th century, an educated lawyer could not really believe in devil possession. Many then assumed that Minnell would prove Johnson's mental insanity rather than demonic possession. However, Minnell was determined to make a national name for himself, and he succeeded. In October 1981 in Danbury, where the hearing of the case of Arn Cheyenne Johnson, there was a real full house. In the town, where at that time lived about 70,000 people, came thousands of reporters, tourists, and just fans of the supernatural. They wanted to see with their own eyes how the story would end. Local hotels were literally bursting with visitors, with room reservations flying out like promotional pizza. There were fears that the tiny courtroom in Danbury, with a capacity of no more than 70 people, was too small for the high-profile case. As the trial date approached, Minnell became increasingly agitated. He traveled to England to consult with lawyers who had been involved in possession cases. He told reporters that he was negotiating to subpoena exorcism experts, and also threatened the priests that he would force them to appear in court and tell about casting demons out of David Glatzel. I'm going to prove that Arn Cheyenne Johnson is not crazy. Once upon a time, the courts dealt with cases that proved the existence of God. Now it's time for them to deal with finding out if there's a demonic spirit. The trial began, which wanted to hear witnesses first. Judy Glatzel, 45, the mother of 11-year-old David, began telling the judge and jury how her youngest son had been talking about ghosts since July 3, 1980. It started with a terrifying dream. In it, little David allegedly saw a terrifying monster. A man not man, a beast not beast, a creature with black hollows instead of eyes, pointed ears, teeth sticking out of its mouth, horns and hooves. In the dream it frightened the child wildly, saying one single word, "Look out." David woke up sobbing with terror. But from then on, the dream came to him with enviable regularity. After a while, something paranormal began to happen in the house. A nightmarish half-beast half-man appeared to David while he was awake. But now he looked like an old man with a white beard, dressed in jeans and a shirt. It happened while he was cleaning a rented house. David spoke. The old man pushed him in the chest, mumbled texts in Latin, and threatened to steal his soul. At first, the Glatzeli elders thought that the child was trying to avoid cleaning with such fabrications. But David assured them that the old man had sworn to harm the Glatzels if they continued to live in the house. They had indeed heard some strange noises in the attic, and though they had not seen the evil ghost, they believed the child. Frightened by her brother's stories, 27-year-old Debbie then decided to invite her boyfriend, 19-year-old Arn Cheyenne Johnson, to live in their house for a while. When asked by the judge why David's father, mother, and sister believed the child had real visionary visions rather than sleep and mental health issues, the Glatzel family members had the same response. "We believed David. He had never lied to us before, and he didn't like anything creepy. He didn't even watch scary comic books, let alone horror movies." At some point, the Glatzel family, who believed the child's stories, realized something had to be done about it. So the idea to turn to the priests was formed. They went to St. Joseph's Catholic Church for help. The house occupied by demons was sanctified, but it had no effect. That's when brave Ed and Lorraine Warren stepped in. Lorraine later described her first meeting with David Glatzel this way. When Ed was talking to the boy, I saw a black blob of fog next to him, and I realized we were dealing with something negative. Soon the child said someone was strangling him, and there were red finger marks on his neck. Debbie Glatzel, speaking at the trial, continued her mother's story. She said that her younger brother had changed a lot since he became demon-possessed, growling, hissing, and speaking in alien voices. He refused to go to school, ate a lot, which caused him to gain more than 27 extra pounds. He had strange fits of rabies. The boy levitated, predicted the future, and lost the ability to breathe. And the most sinister moments were his abrupt and unmotivated quotations of passages from the Bible and Milton's Paradise Lost. The boy was feared for, and for months someone was on duty by his bedside every night. All the while, the Warrens continued to come to the Glatzel home, according to the family, to help, but I suspect it was to advise the Glatzels on how to do something else horrible. Lorraine would later reveal in an interview that at some point David started talking constantly about murders and stabbings. He was feared and never left alone for a moment. At the Warrens' request, it was as if the church had agreed to perform a classic exorcism rite. The first stage, involving 4 priests, took place at St. Joseph's Church. It was then that it became clear that David had not just one demon, but 43 of them, all of whose names the boy told the priests as if they were true. During the ritual, Arn Johnson began taunting one of the main demons, and according to the Warrens and Glatzels, the demon became very angry, left the 11-year-old boy's body, and probably took over Johnson's. Just so you understand, the exorcism that the Warrens and the priests performed on David Glatzel is most likely a fabrication. The higher-ups of the church and the priests whose names the Warrens gave always said they knew nothing about any David Glatzel. They never authorized an exorcism for him, much less participated in one. Why would they lie if it really happened? According to the Warrens, however, this stage of the exorcism completely failed to help the child, and they began to think among themselves that David's story was clearly going to end badly. By the end of October, Judy and Carl Glatzel Sr. apparently had an epiphany. They sought help from a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist was already familiar with David and knew that the boy suffered from a learning disability and had an IQ level close to imbecility. Because of this, David did not attend a regular school, but a private school for children with mental retardation. The child needed specific work, but the Glatzels made a different decision, to move out of the dangerous home. In November, they left their rental home, temporarily moving into a motel there in Brookfield. At that time, Alan Bono came to town, determined to set up a foster home, hotel, and dog grooming business there. Debbie went to work for him as his assistant, and all would be well. The cursed house was a thing of the past, and David complained less often about demons. But now Arn, Debbie's lover, has changed. Never having broken the law before, and having left school to help his parents feed their family, he was suddenly angry and sullen. Cheyenne had once been a great baseball player, sang in the church choir, and was a kind kid, ready to help his loved ones. Now it was as if he'd been replaced. One day, a demon completely possessed his mind, causing him to steer his car into a tree. After this incident, Johnson, realizing that something was wrong with him, went to the house left by the Glatzels. There he looked into a deep old well and met the gaze of his demon. As Johnson himself will tell at the trial, it was his last day of full and clear mind. The encounter with the demon deprived the boy of reason, making him completely subject to the evil spirit. Henceforth, growling, hissing, and screaming with evil voices began 19-year-old Johnson, and Debbie realized that David's demon had possessed her soulmate. By the time this happened, Debbie and Johnson had rented a separate apartment in Brookfield. The apartment was close to Debbie's work, and it was in that apartment that Johnson began exhibiting behavior strikingly similar to David's. Cheyenne growled, hallucinated, and flew through the air. He demonstrated an active appetite, and even more so, a craving for alcohol. At the trial, Debbie Glatzel said that 6 months before Alan Bono's murder, Arn had 4 terrible seizures. He fell into a kind of trance, and in it, he saw a creepy half-beast. And when he came to himself, he remembered nothing. February 16, 1981, Johnson came to the nursery to Debbie, where her sister Wanda and 9-year-old cousin Mary also worked. At lunchtime, Alan Bono invited everyone to have a drink or two at the bar, where he and Arn Cheyenne got drunk on wine. After lunch, the Mary company went to Debbie and Johnson's apartment. Wanda and Mary were sent for pizza, and Debbie was watching closely the active conversation between Arn and Bono. The two of them began to get cocky and swear at each other in a drunken frenzy. Then Bono suddenly grabbed little Mary, who had returned with the pizza, and covering himself with the child, began to swear at Cheyenne. He demanded that Mary be let go, and then he lashed out at Alan with his fists. At that moment, the girl dodged and ran away, and the conflict between the men reached a climax. Wanda tried in vain to distract Johnson, but he, possessed by the devil, growling like an animal, pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and stabbed Bono several times with it. That's roughly how the Warrens, Arn Cheyenne, Debbie Glatzel, and her sister Wanda, told the story of Alan Bono's murder. From their story, it appeared that Arn Cheyenne Johnson was not guilty of anything. It was a demon, not alcohol and bad temper, that guided his knife hand into the victim's chest. He, the evil demonic force, is the real killer. The public and journalists, following the events in the conference room, listened to all this, holding their breath. Wow, a story of real horror and nightmare. It should be made into a movie script. But fortunately for common sense, and to the honor of American justice, Judge Robert J. Callahan did not heed the stories of the defendant and his associates. He would later describe the moment quite sarcastically. Somewhere along the way to his goal of pinning the murder on Satan and his minions, attorney Martin Minnella was ambushed. I will not consider the defense's version of the demon's guilt in the murder, and that's it, he said almost at the very beginning of the trial. And up to the announcement of the verdict, he did not change his opinion one iota. He called the arguments of the lawyer irrelevant, unprovable, unscientific, and confusing for the jury to understand. Prosecutor Walter D. Flanagan and the police were of the same opinion. Their version of the explanation for Alan Bono's murder was simple and primitive. At some point while drugging both men with alcohol, Bono made a lewd remark about Johnson's girlfriend. The two men got into a fight, and it ended in a domestic stabbing. This is what happens on a regular basis all over the world. God forbid we give alcoholics and deadbeats the right to think they can blame any drunken crime on demons. Prosecutor Flanagan, who had told the press almost nothing about the case against Johnson before the trial began, said that it did have its own demon, the name of which was drunkenness. On the day of the murder, Johnson and Bono had been drinking for half a day. The waitress serving them at the bar testified that she served the men 3 decanters of red wine, which they successfully sipped. The prosecution then presented another witness, the driver of the ambulance that arrived at Debbie and Johnson's apartment for the call. He described how he clearly heard a conversation between the girl and her father. Debbie repeated several times, "Oh, Daddy, he didn't mean to do it. You know how Johnson acts when he gets drunk." The testimony of Arn Cheyenne's co-workers, with whom he worked at Johnson's store, was also informative. The entire time that Debbie said Johnson was possessed by the devil, he worked at the store and no one saw not only his seizures, but no change in behavior at all. In response to all this, Minnella tried to call 4 priests into the courtroom, but Judge Callahan would not allow it. To top it all off, the judge called Ed Warren, a witness without any knowledge, allowed him to say only a couple of sentences, and would listen no more. Suddenly, the case, dubbed by reporters by the will of the devil, lost its luster and mystique. Many journalists and supporters of the supernatural who had traveled to Brookfield from all over the country left on the 3rd day of the trial. Martin Minnella, realizing that he had been figured out, tried to replay his story, calling Arn Cheyenne's actions self-defense. It took the jury 15 hours to reach its verdict. On November 24, 1981, Johnson was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter and given 10 to 20 years to life behind bars. The jury's explanation for such a weak and seemingly inappropriate punishment was simple. They don't think Johnson intended to kill Bono. More likely, it was a drunken brawl, and Arn picked up the knife only to wound Bono. In the end, Arn served just under 5 years behind bars. He was released for good behavior. While still in captivity, January 30th, 1985, he married Deborah Glatzel. The further fate of this nice couple is little known to me, and admittedly, almost completely uninteresting.